So we're picking up today on Nun Beis 50b, the last part of the daf that we're finishing off. So the Gemara says the following. The Gemara says, my time to Rav. So remember, the Gemara quoted a machlukas between Rav and Shmuel regarding the nature of the ability of a bar to damage. So Rav explained that the bar, you're chayiv for havala, for the noxious odor, or the noxious air, versus Shmuel, who holds that yes, the noxious air is problematic, but you're also chayiv for the impact with the ground. So my time to Rav, what's Rav's logic? To Amar the pasuk says, v'nafal. Pasuk, speaking about bar, says the animal will fall into the bar, at sheyipal derech nefila, until it falls in the normative way, which means, the Rashi points out, head first, and therefore again it's the noxious air that ultimately kills the animal. L'shmuel v'nafal kol du mashmo. Shmuel says the word v'nafal is a generic term for falling. So the Gemara says, Imkain lam uj Shmuel nafchol du mashmo. Imkain lama ne'emar bar. If that's the case, then why does the Torah specifically use the word bar? Ma bar sheish pokadei lahamis asar tfachim. Just like a bar has the ability to kill at a depth of 10 tfachim, af kol sheish pokadei lahamis asar tfachim. So to any other pit or hole that has the ability to kill at the depth of 10 tfachim, one will be chayiv for. So bishlam l'shmuel af kol la'asuye gova. So according to Shmuel, that phrase af kol, so to anything that has a height or I should say a depth of 10, is not just depth, but it also refers to height. Even if you built it, remember again, a mound of 10 tfachim and the animal climbs up and falls off and dies, one would be chayiv for that as well. El Rav af kol la'asuye mai. But according to Rav, what does that phrase af kol come to include? La'asuye charitzin uni'itzin. To come to include a charitzin are square pits, ne'itzin are wedge pits. Charitzin and ne'itzin behedge katani. But ultimately, again, those are stated explicitly in the Mishnah, to which the Gemara says, Tani v'hadar mefarish. Ultimately, again, the Mishnah states them, but then goes on to explain them. V'hani kulu diktani lama litzricha. Why do I need the Mishnah to state all the different kinds of pits? Di'itana bar, because had the Mishnah just written a bar, hava amina bar asaruhu de'ispe havla, mishum dekatin ukricha. I would have thought a bar at a depth of 10 tfachim has noxious air. Why? Because the katin v'kricha, because ultimately again it's small. Rashi says katzar v'agol. It's short and it's rounded. Aval siach da'arich, but a ditch which is longer. Ema ba'asar lesle havla. The idea over here with the pit, the bar, is that because it's a small area, the noxious air kind of gathers, and therefore that's perhaps why it kills. But in a siach, which is a longer ditch, I would have thought because there's more area for the air to diffuse, then maybe lemaisa again, at a depth of 10 it does not cause a problem. I would have, and if it would have just said siach, I would have thought that siach at a depth of 10 has the noxious air, mishum dekatin, because it's narrow. Aval ma'ara is actually a vault. The merabba, that's square, ima ba'asara les behavla. Perhaps again at a depth of 10 it does not contain the right amount of noxious air. Vitana ma'ara, and if it would have said the case of ma'ara, hava mina ma'ara ba'asarahu deis behavla, I would have said that a ma'ara at a depth of 10 tfachim has the noxious air, mishum dimetalala, because it's roofed. Aval charitzin delo metalali, but a charitz which ultimately is not roofed, ema ba'asar lesbu havla, perhaps again the noxious air does not properly gather and therefore it doesn't have the capacity to kill. Vitana charitzin, and if it would say charitzin, hava mina charitzin asaruhu deisbu havla, I would have said it's the charitzin that have the noxious air at a depth of 10 tfachim, the mishum the less bohu revicha milael tfemi tasoi, because ultimately again they are no larger on top than they are on the bottom. Aval neitzin, but neitzin is the wedge-like pit. The revichi milael tfemi tasoi ema basar less bohu. I would have thought that perhaps again by the neitzin, which ultimately are larger on the top and narrower at the bottom, perhaps they don't have the noxious air. Therefore again Kamma shmalon. Therefore the Mishnah effectively teaches me that halacha lemaisa, again all these different types of pits, even though they have different types of dimensions and different types of shapes, once there is a depth of 10 tfachim, so that allows ultimately again for the collection of the noxious air, which ultimately could result in the death of the animal. Alright, we will stop over here. Meretz Hashem will pick up at the 2 dots tomorrow. Wishing everyone a wonderful evening. Alright, so we'll say good morning. Let's begin. Today's daf is not a lot to do today. Hopefully you did your homework last night. We're going to pick up in Meretz Hashem, third wide line in at the two dots, Tanan. Says the Gemara, Tanan, hayu pechusin me'asar tfachim. If the bar was less than 10 tfachim, remember again, 10 tfachim is the depth. As the depth at which we assume the bar is capable of damaging. Machlokes Rav and Shmuel. Remember again about how exactly a bar does damage. Does a bar damage ultimately again through its hevel, through its noxious air? Does a bar damage through impact? So Tanan, we'll say Nun Amud Beis 50b, third wide line. Two dots. Tanan, hayu pchusin me'asar tfachim. If the bar was less than 10 tfachim deep, and a shar or chamar falls in, an ox or a donkey falls in and died, putter. Ultimately, again, the owner of the pit is putter. Why? We'll say because we assume that if a pit is less than 10 tfachim, then what? It does not have the capacity to kill. But if instead of being killed, the animal was injured, then chayiv. Then ultimately, again, the owner of the bar will be chayiv. So remember, we said before that if the shar chamar falls into a pit less than 10 tfachim and dies, ultimately the owner is pater. My time, what's the reason? Lav mishum deles bechavata. Ultimately, because a pit of less than 10 tfachim doesn't have the necessary impact to kill upon impact. Supposed to say, what does this show you? This shows you ultimately, like Shmuel, that the issue of a bar is impact and not hevel, not noxious air. To which the Gemara says, "Lo, we shouldn't less behavla." No, it's because less than 10 tefachim doesn't have the requisite noxious air to kill the animal. If that's the case, if the animal is injured by the bar, you are chayiv. How could you be chayiv? Less behavla. Remember again, then how would the animal even get injured if it's less than 10 tefachim deep and it doesn't have hevel, it doesn't have the noxious air? Then how does the animal get injured? Amri in havla v'misa v'yesh havla nezikin. The case of Osai is where what? It doesn't have the necessary noxious air to kill the animal, but it does have the necessary noxious air in order to go ahead and injure the animal. So says the Gemara, Hahu Tura dinafel la'arisa dideloi. Is an interesting case. There was an ox that fell into an irrigation ditch. I will say the irrigation ditch was 6 tfachim deep. 6 tfachim deep. What happens? Shachte mare. So we'll say, so listen to this. So the animal falls into the irrigation ditch, and apparently, again, the owner was concerned that the animal was going to die. So the owner had a great chap. What did he do? He shechted the animal. His goal was to be able to save the value of the animal by shechting it now. Tarfei Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman declared that the animal was a treifa. Now, why did he declare the animal was a treifa? Look at Rashi. Tarfei Rav Nachman. Mishum risuke avarim. Di achos miyud ches treifas. And I will say, remember again, the halacha is there are 18 different things that make an animal a treifa. A treifa is an animal that has some type of injury or some type of condition from which it would die within the next year. One of the examples the Gemara brings down is if an animal, let's say, falls off the roof, nafla min agag, or right. So what happens? So that's called risuke avarim. The animal suffers some type of trauma. So there is a concern that the animal is now a treifa. How do you tell if the animal is a treifa or not? Well, if the animal after falling survives 24 hours, that tells us that the animal is okay, not a treifa. So this guy went ahead and shechted the animal right then and there. As a result, Rav Nachman ruled it a treifa. Essentially, he ruled it a treifa out of suffix. Rav Nachman said, "Ishakol mareit the haitura kaba de kimcha." If this guy would have taken the money, the value of one kav of flour. Right now, that was the value it would have taken for him to travel to the base medrash. Va'azal tana be midrasha, and he would have gone ahead and learned in the base medrash that imshah sameh isla is kshera, that animal after suffering trauma, if you let it sit for 24 hours and it's still alive, that it's no longer a treifa. Lo av sedei lotura deshava kamakabi. He would not have lost an ox that's worth many kabin of flour. So ultimately, Rav Nachman said, because you rushed to go ahead and shech the animal now, so ultimately we have no choice but to declare it a treifa. But lemaisa again, had you waited 24 hours and the animal still been alive, the animal would have been outside the gate of Cherub. I'll say just an incredible yisod also. Sometimes in life we feel compelled to take immediate and decisive action because we feel compelled to act. When sometimes, again, we could benefit ourselves so much more by this. It's kind of like the opposite of what we just said in the Ramchal, right? Because in life there are different things. Sometimes you have to act quickly and decisively. Sometimes you have to know kind of when things are ambiguous or not clear, how to take a step back for just a moment and allow a little bit of clarity. The animal falls off. The owner is in a rush. He wants to save the animal, shechts it right then and there, without realizing that, yes, the animal may die, but at the same time, again, the animal may be cleared from all treifa status. Incredible balance in life, knowing when to act decisively and quickly, knowing when to take a step back and allowing things to become a bit more clarified. So the Gemara goes weiter. Now remember again, what's the depth of the pit we're dealing with over here? 6 tvachim. 6 tvachim. So what do you see from here? That Rav Nachman holds, now Rav Nachman clearly ruled that the animal after falling into a pit of 6 tvachim was what? Was a treifa, which tells us that Lamaisa, according to Rav Nachman, even a pit less than 10 tefachim has the ability to kill. To which the Gemara says, Rav Nachman. So Rava comes along and asks Rav Nachman, Hayu pechusin me'asar tefachim. If a pit was less than 10 tefachim, v'nafal socho shara chamar, and a shara chamar falls into it, umeis, and died, pater. Ultimately, the owner of the pit is pater. My time, what's the reason? Is it not because that a pit that's less than 10 tefachim does not have the requisite depth to go ahead and cause death upon it? Does not have the requisite depth to cause death upon impact. To which the Gemara says, Lo, Mishum de Lespe Havlo. No, it's because, again, less than 10 tvachim, it doesn't have the necessary amount of noxious air. Ihaki, if that's the case, Hozak bo chayiv, ha lespe havla. If that's the case in a pit of less than 10 tvachim, why is the Brisa said that if you got injured by it, you would be chayiv. But why? If there's not the necessary amount of noxious air in the space, then Lamaisa, why are you chayiv? Amarle in havla lemisa, veish hevel lenizakim. It's true, there's not enough noxious air to kill the animal, but there's enough noxious air to ultimately injure the animal. Eisvei, so that's another kasha, but it's an interesting idea. Beis haskila. Remember again, skila is one of the arba misos bezin, one of the 4 types of death penalties that bezin would administer. So the beis haskila, which is the place where they would stone the person, haya gavoa shtei komos, was 2 stories tall. Now I will say, stories in this context, Rashi understands, means heights, person heights. So it seems to be, according to most opinions, the Beis HaSkila was about 6 amos. 6 amos tall, which actually is not such a great height. But in any event, it was shtei komos, v'tani alav a komos shalo. Plus, remember, we go ahead and we include the height of the individual himself, because I will say the person is pushed off the Beis HaSkila head first. So the idea over here is that essentially his fall is 3 stories high. So harikan shalosh. Ultimately, again, we have 3 stories. I will say, now if we assume that a pit that is 10 tefachim deep has the ability to kill, then why do you need a Beis HaSkila that's so tall? In other words, again, throwing him off 10 tefachim should also be enough. To which the Gemara says, why not just go to make the Beis HaSkila 10 tefachim tall? Ella kirat nachman. The Rebbe said this amazing Gemara. You shall love your fellow as you love yourself. What does that mean? Barer lo misa yafa. It will say, if you have to execute someone, execute him in the kindest, most humane way possible. Rashi says, what does it mean? Misa yafa sheyamos maher. Execute him in a way where he dies quickly. So therefore, again, says the Gemara, we dafka the Beis HaSkila is dafka higher than 10 tefachim in order that what? In order that the impact of the fall kill him immediately. So if that's the case again, why not make the Beis HaSkila higher? Right? So why are you stopping at 3 stories? Why don't you make it higher? It'll die even faster. Mishum de minovel. Because I will say this concern is that if the fall is too high, the body becomes severely disfigured. And that would be a lack of kavod amei. So therefore we make it high enough that he dies on impact, but not too high that ultimately, again, the body becomes severely disfigured. Raise another kasha. Remember again, the Torah here commands us to put up a makkah, to put up a fence around a roof. Why? Because there's in order to ensure that no one falls off my roof. So the Gemara says, Mimenu velo besocho. So you see from here that you're only chayiv, that one has to ensure that no one falls off his roof, but does not have to ensure that no one falls into his roof. Now, what does that mean? Ketzad? We'll say, imagine for a moment that a person's house is next to Rosh Hashanah. Again, I'm built in a valley. So what happens? Rosh Hashanah is actually higher than my home. So let's say Rosh Hashanah is higher than my home 10 tefachim. And one falls from Rosh Hashanah onto my roof. The halacha is pater. Ultimately, I, the roof owner, am pater. Amuka mimenu asara. But if my home is taller than the Rosh Hashanah and the Rosh Hashanah is 10 tefachim below my home, v'nafa misocho l'socha, and one falls from the roof to Rosh Hashanah, chayiv. Ultimately, the homeowner, the roof owner, will be chayiv. And if you want to say that there is deadly impact, even less than your tvachim, lamali asara. So we'll say, so why? So remember, what the Gemara seems to say over here is that only if the roof is 10 tefachim taller than the ground level, that's when you're chayiv to go ahead and put up a fence. But based on what Rav Nachman said before, also remember again, all of this is coming off Rav Nachman's statement, where the animal fell into the irrigation ditch, and Rav Nachman essentially ruled the animal a treifa, which tells us that, according to Rav Nachman, less than 10 tefachim has the ability to kill upon impact. If that's the case, why do we say that the roof has to be at least 10 tefachim off the ground, off the Surabim, in order to be obligated to put up a fence? Even for 6 tefachim, we should be obligated to put up a fence. To which the Gemara says, no. Amalei shani bayis, dechol pachos me'asara lav bayisu. Because it will say a home is different. Because if you are less than 10 tefachim tall, that's not a home. That's not a home. Others will both say, it's what's called, we learned this in Masechah Sukkah of a dira srucha. Dira srucha, a compromised home. So nobody builds a home less than 10 tefachim tall. And if you build a house in 10 tefachim tall, that's like, it's not a home. It's not a home. Therefore, by definition, it wouldn't require a makkah. It wouldn't require a fence. Says the Gemara, but says the Gemara, 1 second, if you're dealing with a rooftop that has a height of 10 tefachim, I will say, what does that tell you? That tells you that the interior of the home is not 10 tefachim, right? Again, think about this. If the height from the ground to the top of the roof ultimately is 10 tefachim, remember again, you don't have 10 tefachim of interior space, because some of that interior space is taken up by the plaster, it's taken up by the roof. If that's the case, a 10 tefach tall roof, by definition, gives you less than 10 tefachim of domicile space. If that's the case, it shouldn't even be an appropriate home. The case is, is that the person dug out some of the floor of his home, ultimately to be mashlim, to complete the airspace of 10 tefachim inside the home as well. So we'll say, so now, okay, so we're back to square one, which is, we are trying to understand Rav Nachman's shita. Rav Nachman seems to be saying that even a pit of 10 tefachim, of 6 tefachim, has the ability to kill. To which the Gemara says, here's Rav Nachman's logic. Sarah, listen to this. Mikreisei de Tura la'ara, Kamma habi. They both say, what's the distance ultimately again from the belly, from the stomach of the animal to the ground? What's that airspace? Arba. Generally, it's 4 tefachim. Therefore, again, Arisa de Dalai Kamma haba. How much airspace did the pit in Rav Nachman's case have? Shisa, 6 tefachim. Therefore, again, ha'asara. So this is an interesting case. So Rav Nachman suggests over here that when calculating the distance of the fall of the animal, we incorporate the distance of the airspace between the animal's stomach and the ground. So there's 4 tefachim between the animal's stomach on the ground, 6 tefachim in the pit itself. Put that all together, Rav Nachman posits you have a fall of 10 tefachim. So because you have a fall of 10 tefachim, therefore again, that's what Rav Nachman ruled in this case, that the animal ultimately was a treifa. So the Gemara says, therefore, it turns out that when the animal has impact with the ground of the bar, the animal in fact had a fall of 10 tefachim. If that's the case, then why did the Mishnah seem to indicate that in order for a bar to kill an animal, it has to have a depth of 10 tefachim? The truth is, it sounds like what? Even 6 tefachim should ultimately be enough. To which the Gemara says, "Masnisen de'in gader lebar." The case of the Mishnah Abosai was where what? Where the animal was rolling. So if the animal is rolling, then what? There is no airspace between its stomach and between the ground. So where the animal is rolling, you need all 10 tefachim in the bar. apparently where the animal is standing, lemaisa, again, the airspace between the stomach of the animal and the ground counts as part of the distance of the impact. Now, lemaisa, we don't paskin like Rav Nachman. At the end of the day, again, in order for a bar to be capable of killing, we paskin that it has to have yud tfachim of airspace in the bar itself. Weiter. Bar shel shnei shutfin. Rabbi says it's actually a very interesting case. You have a bar that belongs to two partners. Avar alav harishon velo kiso, vashini velo kiso. Rabbi says, listen to this. So two partners, Reuven and Shimon, both own a bar. What happens? Reuven leaves the bar and fails to close it. Shimon leaves the bar and fails to close it as well. Meaning Reuven leaves first, leaves it open. Shimon leaves second and still leaves it open. What's the halacha? Hasheni chayiv. Shimon, the second guy there, is responsible for damages of the bar. Right? The logic ultimately being that Shimon was the last person there. He had the responsibility to cover the bar. He did not do so. Therefore, he's chayav for damages. Amri bar, says the Gemara, Amri bar shel shnei shutfin. So remember again, you're talking about a case of a bar that's owned by partners. Heichin mishkachosla. I will say, how do you ever have a case of a bar owned by partners? Now let's analyze this. So according to Rabbi Akiva, who says that a bar b'shus hayachid is chayiv, you could find the case. How so? We had this yesterday. Mishkachas la b'chatzar shel shnehem ubar shel shnehem v'evkiru rishusan v'lo evkiru boram. Remember, Rabbi Akiva is of the opinion that's what the paradigmatic case of bar is where someone digs a bar on his property. He's mafkir the property around the bar, but what? Retains ownership over the bar itself. That, according to Rabbi Akiva, is the biblically paradigmatic case of bar. So, according to Rabbi Akiva, the case of a bar shel shutfin is very simple. Reuven and Shimon own land jointly together. They dig a pit on that jointly owned land. So they own the land, they own the pit together. They're mafkir the land around the pit together, but they retain ownership of the pit itself together. That's the bar of shnei shutfin. Ella isvira lon. But if you don't hold like Rabbi Akiva, you hold like the Rabbanon who say that no, if you retain ownership of a bar, that's not the bar of the Torah. So therefore, again, how are you going to have a case of bar shel shnei shutfin? To which the Gemara says it must be what? B'reshus harabim. It must be that the bar is dug in Reshus harabim. B'reshus harabim. Bar shel shnei shutfin heichi mishkachosla. We'll say, how can you ever have a jointly owned bar in Reshus harabim? Because remember again, when it comes to Reshus harabim, we're going to see the person who digs it is the one ultimately who's responsible for it. So we'll say, if you want to say that Reuven and Shimon appointed a shaliach, and they say to the shaliach, zil karilan va'azil karilu, and they say to the shaliach, go and dig for us a pit in Reshus harabim, and he does it on their behalf. So we'll say that's not a jointly owned pit. Why? Who does that pit belong to? That belongs to the shaliach. Why? Because ein shliach lidvar avera. Right? So the act of digging a pit in Reshus harabim is a ma'isa avera. And again, there's no shliach, there's no agency for the commission of an avera. Therefore, even if Reuven and Shimon appoint the shaliach to go ahead and dig the pit in Reshus harabim, it is the shaliach who has responsibility for that pit. V'idikara hay chamisha v'hay chamisha. So maybe you'll say Reuven dug the first 5 tvachim, and Shimon dug the second 5 tvachim. Well, that doesn't work either. Why? Because the guy, once you have a guy digging the second 5 tefachim, his actions eclipse the actions of the first, and therefore, again, the pit will be considered as if it belongs to who? As if it belongs to the second party. To which the Gemara says, So we'll say we're going to discuss it just a moment. So this makes sense according to Rabbi, and you can see again why one would be chayav for damages. Ella l'Rebbe u'lemisa. But according to Rebbe, in a case where the pit causes death, u'l'Rabbanan bein misa l'nizakin heichem mishkachas la. Or according to the rabbis, both in the case of misa and nizikin, how can you ever have a bar shel shnei shutfin, a jointly owned bar? But I will say now, we'll see what the case of Rebbe and the Rabbanan is in just a moment. But before we get to that, Amar Rav Yochanan, what's the case? Kigon sha'akru shneihen chulya bevas achos ve'shlimo la'asara. I will say, just so we answer this question, what's the case of a jointly owned bar? So the case of a jointly owned bar, I will say, would be where Reuven and Shimon, right? It doesn't really matter who's digging the pit. One of them are, both of them are, it doesn't matter. But they get there, both say, they remove the last clod of earth together. So let's say, if you could imagine, there's a huge clod of earth, right? Let's say the pit is now 9 tefachim. There's a huge 1 tefach clod of earth sitting there. So what happens? they lift up the clod of earth together. Therefore, jointly they make this pit into a 10 tefach pit. That, says the Gemara, is the case of bar shal shnei shutfin. To which the Gemara says, my Rebbe Rabbanon, Gemara, you made reference to Machlokes Rabbi and Rabbanon. What's that case? This is how you listen to this. Echad hachofer bar. Okay, jeez, give me 1 second. Echad hachofer bar. Echad hachofer was slave drivers. Echad hachofer bar. Echad hachofer bar tisha. So what happens? Somebody dug a pit that was 9 tefachim deep. And what happens? By the way, this kind of case is actually an interesting one in general, of where you have essentially like contributory negligence. You have multiple people going ahead and doing something irresponsible or damaging, but one of them is like the makebe patish, right? One of them is like the guy who he finishes it off. So Rebbe says, so before we get to Rebbe, so a person's digging a pit for 9 tefachim. So Reuven digs 9 tefachim of the pit. Shimon comes along and digs the 10th tefach. So who's chayiv? Rebbe Omer, achara lemisa. So we'll say it depends. If an animal falls into the pit and dies, so who's responsible for that? Shimon's responsible for that. Why? Because it's only a 10 tefach pit that has the ability to kill. So therefore Shimon, who made the pit into a pit capable of killing by digging the 10th tefach, he was responsible if the animal dies. However, but ultimately, both Reuven and Shimon will both be chayav for damages. Why? Because Reuven's digging of 9 tefachim and Shimon's digging of the 10th tefach both contribute towards the ability of the bar to damage. My time in the Rabbana. So we'll say, I'm sorry. You know what? I'm sorry. Let's read this once more. So we'll say the shita of the Rabbanan is that it's the last guy who digs the 10th tefach that is chayiv across the board. Whatever happens in that bar, an animal falls in and dies, an animal falls in and is injured, the second guy who dug the 10th tefach, he is the one who is responsible. Rebbe says we split responsibility. For death, it's the second guy, it's Shimon, who dug the 10th tefach, will be responsible. But however, again, for injuries, for damages, both will be chayav for damages. Fine, that's Machlokes Rabbi and the Rabbanan. So my time is the Rabbanan. What's the Rabbanan's logic? So the Rabbanan say, it's the second guy who dug the 10th tefach. He is the one who is responsible across the board. What's the logic? To Amakra, ki yiftach v'chi yichre. Because the pasuk says, if you will go ahead and open a pit or dig a pit, if you're chayiv for opening the pit, does it not go without saying that you're chayiv ultimately for digging the pit as well? Rather, it's coming to teach me one who digs after one who already dug. So I will say, if you are the second digger, you are the second person who dug, the pit becomes yours. In other words, whoever is the final digger of this pit, ultimately again is responsible for the pit itself. So we'll say, even though the first guy made a pit that was capable of damaging, when the second guy comes along and digs that 10th tefach, he assumes full responsibility for the bar. Full responsibility for the bar. So the Gemara says, V'Rebbe Amalacha, Rebbe will say, Hano mitzrach tzrichi. No. These phrases are necessary. Kid da'aminan. Rabbi said, right, we learned about the necessity for Yiftach and for Yichra in yesterday's daf. V'Rabbanan nami mitzrach tzrichi. The Rabbanan agreed to the drashas that we learned yesterday. Ella hainu taimid the Rabbanan, rather the rabbis explain, Amakra, ki yichra ishbar. So we'll say, it's interesting, the Rabbanan say like this, the Torah, when phrasing the liability for bar, uses the singular. The ki yichra ish, when a person will dig a pit, which tells us what? Echad v'lo shnayim. According to the Rabbanan and Rabbosai is, the liability for bar can only rest on the shoulders of one person. Therefore what? When you have 2 people who are digging the bar, it's the second digger, ultimately again, who will be chayiv for damages. The Rebbe will say, No. That ish is necessary to teach us what? That you're only chayiv for a bar if a person digs the bar. But if the shar dug the bar, you are not chayiv. The Rabbanan, trei ish bar ksivi. The Rabbanan will say, it says that phrase, ish bar twice. The Rebbe, I did the kasav high. Rabbi will say that's just to provide, or just to continue, textual symmetry. How do you know? So Rabbi, fine. So Rabbanan, fine. You want to say that it's only the last guy, only one guy could be chayiv. How do you know it's the last guy who's chayiv? Maybe what? Maybe it's the first guy who's chayiv. To which the Gemara says, "Lo sakadaytcha da amarkra v'hameis yihiyeh lo." The pasuk says the carcass will belong to him. Hahu de ka'avid misa. I will say ultimately the one who caused the death of the animal, which in this case is what? The guy who dug the 10th tefach. But yet we need that phrase yellow for Drasha Rava. What did Rava say? The Amar Rava, sharp psulei mikdashin shnaf alabar pater. We'll say if you have a sharp, we'll say psulei mikdashin means an animal ultimately again that was supposed to be offered up as a karban, but became disqualified because of some type of mum or blemish. So that animal remains ultimately in the possession of the owner, but Lamaisa still has a consecrated status. What happens if that shar, that Psulei Mikdashin, falls into a pit? The halakha Rabosai is that the Baal Habar is potter. Why? Shene'emar v'hameis yihiyeh lo. Because also when it comes to bar, the Torah says that the carcass of the animal will belong to him. What do we learn from there? B'misha meis shalo. You're only chayiv in bar if you have the ability to keep the carcass. To which the Gemara says, but if you don't have the ability to keep the carcass, like in the case of Psulei Mikdashin, then what? Then you're off on a technicality. You're not chayiv for bar. So the Gemara says, Amri, v'lab memela shamis yunah bahuda avid misa. But is it not obvious again? Is it not obvious that the one ultimately who made the bar into capable of damaging old askinon ultimately will be chayev for bar? So we have over here a machlokas between Rebbe and the Rabbanon, fundamental machlokas which we're not finished with, but fundamental machlokas in Rebbe and the Rabbanon. When you have Reuven and Shimon both digging the bar, Reuven digs the first 9, Shimon digs the 10th tefach. Who is chayev? The Rabbanon, Shitas Rabbanon Rabosai is the last digger is always chayev. Right, the last person who participates in the creation of the bar, he takes on responsibility for the bar, in all purposes. Rebbe is mechalik between death and damages. When it comes to death, yes, it's Shimon who is chayiv. Why? Why? Because it's really Shimon who made the bar into capable of causing death by digging the 10th tefach. When it comes to damages, Reuven and Shimon both share responsibility because the logic of that is Reuven dug a pit that was capable of damaging. Shimon furthered the damaging ability of that pit, but they share responsibility jointly. That's Mecholokes in the Rabbanon. Keep that in mind. We're going to go back there. Says in Rabbanon, there's an interesting case. What's the case over here? Let's say Reuven dug a pit that was 10 tefachim, and Shimon came along and added another 10 tefachim, making it 20. Or what happens? Or ba'achar b'shlimah l'shloshim. And we'll say then another guy comes along. So Reuven digs 10. Shimon adds on another 10 to 20. And Levi adds on another 10 to 30. This is mamish like the mother of Boros. So what's the halacha? Kulan chayavim. I will say they are all responsible. They're all responsible. Or minhi. So we'll say, now this is an interesting case. Why is this an interesting case? Because Lamaisa, again, Reuven already dug a pit that was capable of killing and injuring. So nevertheless, the Gemara seems to say that the other ones who added on each 10 tefachim are still doing the chayav as well. Or minhu, the Gemara says, well, that's kasha. Listen to this. Reuven dug a bar that was 10 tefachim. Uba achar b'siyed. Shimon comes under while saying what? He plasters the sides of the pit. Vikiyate, or he went ahead and made siyurim. Ultimately, again, he decorated the pit. You know, if you're going to have a pit, it should be stylish. Right? So in other words, he put plaster, and kirim is literally, he made images, like in the plaster on the side of the pit. Now, what's the chap over here? If you look at Rashi says, siyed vikiyate, Rashi says, shemetchilo rachav haya, v'lo haya ba'hevel, v'kach, v'zesh yasuk tzarbo. So the chap over here is like this. You have a pit, the pit had a particular width. When you plaster the sides of the pit, you diminish the opening. Now, the assumption the Gemara is working on is that when you diminish the opening, you make the air in the pit more noxious. The idea is the more room, the more space there is in the pit, the more the noxious air diffuses. The more constricted or the more narrow the pit, the more the noxious air is contained. Thank you. Says the Gemara. So what happens over here? So Reuven dug the pit. It was 10 tefachim. Shimon comes along and plasters the sides of the pit, making it more narrow and consolidating or containing the noxious air. What's the halacha? Ha'acharon chayiv. So this is actually quite interesting. The second guy, the plasterer, will be chayiv. To which the Gemara says, so now here's what's interesting. So in the first case, ultimately again, In the first case, which was Echad Chofer Bar, the first guy's digging a pit, that's 10, second guy 20, second guy 30, all of them are Chayiv. All of them are Chayiv. Yet in the second case, what's happening? First guy's making a pit of 10 Tfachim, and the second guy is plastering it. Yet what does the Brisa say? What does the Brisa say? Only the second guy is chayiv. So we'll say, seems to be an inherent contradiction, because in the first case of the Brisa, the Gemara seems to indicate that when the first guy went ahead and dug 10, second guy 20, second guy 30, first guy is still chayiv. Second case where the first guy dug 10 and the second guy simply plastered, the first guy is pater. So what's happening over here? Says the Gemara, well maybe, Lema harabi harabanan. So it's possible that maybe what Rabbi say, the first case of the Brisa, where everybody is liable, is going to be reflective view of Rebbe. The second case, where only the second guy is chayiv, is going to be the Rabbanan. Because what do the Rabbanan say? The Rabbanan in general say that's what? It's always the second guy is going to be chayiv. Amar Rav Zvid, ha v'ha Rabbanan. Rav Zvid says no. Both cases of the Brisa are Rabbanan. Ad kamo kam Rabbanan achron chayiv, elahecha de la'avid kama shir misa. So Rav Zid will say like this: when did the Rabbanan say that the second guy is chayiv? That's when the first guy did not make a pit that was capable of killing. Like in the case of the first guy dug 9, the second guy dug the 10th. That's why the Rabbanan are going to say that the second guy is chayiv. Aval hichad da'avid kama shir misa. But Rabbi say when the first guy went ahead and made a pit that was capable of killing, meaning he dug 10 tvachim, afilu Rabbanan modu de kulan chayavin. Even the Rabbanan will agree to both sides. That's what? Everyone is going to be chayiv. So therefore, even the first case, where the first guy dug 10, second guy dug the second 10, third guy dug the third 10, even the Rabbanan will agree that all are chayiv. However, again, Baha Sayid v'Kayid Avid Kamashir Misa. But then, what do you do with the second case of the Brisa? So, what about in the case where Reuven dug a pit that was 10 tefachim, Shimon comes along and plasters it? So, what did the Brisa rule? The Brisa said that only Shimon, the plasterer, is going to be chayiv, but not Reuven. So, yet the first one went ahead and made a pit that was capable of killing, the Katani Achron chayiv, and yet it only says that the second one is chayiv. Amri Hasam Shalo Hayaba Hevel Misa. Oh, I will say the case over here in the Brisa is where even though the first guy dug a pit of 10 tefachim, there was the way the pit was dug there was not enough noxious air to kill. Uba achar v'hosif b'hevel lemisa. And the second guy, by plastering the pit and by ultimately again making it more narrow, he made the pit capable into having enough noxious air to kill. Others say Amar Rav Zvid Havaha Rebbe. So we'll say an alternate version of Zvid. Rav Zvid posits that both cases of the Brisa reflect the view of Rebbe. Now remember, Rebbe is the one who holds that when it comes to Misa, the second one is Chayiv, right? The one who added the 10th Tefach. When it comes to Nezikin, to damages, both will be Chayiv. Hach diktani kulan chayav and shafir. So we'll say, so the case that says that they're all chayiv, that makes sense. So case number 1, where the first one dug 10, second one dug 20, third one dug 30, each one added on a 10, that makes sense according to Rebbe. However, hadik tani achron chayiv. But we'll say the second case, where what? Reuven dug a pit of 10 tvachim, Shimon plastered it, and the Brisa ruled that only the second one was chayiv. Kigon shelo haya bahevel lo lemisa v'lo nizakin. Lo nizakin was the case Rabbi says of where when Reuven dug the first pit of 10, there wasn't enough hevel, noxious air to kill or to damage. And the second guy who added the plaster, Rabbi say, created a pit that was capable of having enough noxious air to kill or to damage. Amar Rava says, Hiniach Evan al Piyah. So we'll say, so again, we are still with this machlokes Rebbe and the Rabbanan. About what happens over here in the case Lamaisa again, where one person starts the process and another person completes it. So Rabbanan will say the pit belongs to the second guy, and the second guy will be chayiv. Rabbanan will say, that's the Rabbanan. Rebbe will say it depends. For damages, there's joint liability. For death, ultimately, again, the second one is responsible. So says the Gemara, Amar Rava, Hiniach Evan al Piabar Veshlimala Sara. But so listen to this case. So let's say a person went ahead. Let's say there was a pit that was 9 tefachim. Reuven dug a pit that was 9 tefachim deep. Shimon, instead of digging deeper, what does he do? He creates a lip around the pit, thereby adding an additional tefach of space, of height to the pit. But now, the depth of the pit has now become what? Has now become 10 tefachim. So the Gemara says, Rabbi says, this is the machlokes Rabbi and Rabbanan. So pshita. So is that not obvious? What would you have thought? So I might have thought the following. Maybe the machlokes Rabbi and Rabbanan is only when what? When one digs down. Because if one digs down, so let's say Reuben dug the first 9 tefachim, Shimon digs the 10th tefach, that's where there is a machlokus between Rabbi and the Rabbanon. Because then we could say that the guy who dug the 10th tefach, it's that hevel, it's that nakshis air that comes from the 10th tefach that ultimately what? That ultimately goes ahead and kills the individual. But I would have thought Rabbi said that maybe that's what, when you add a lip, right, when you add height to the bar, so it's not your hevel, it's not your air that ultimately is going ahead and killing the individual. Therefore, perhaps you should not be chayiv. Therefore, again, kamash malon. Therefore, Rabbi says it's very important halacha. Therefore, kamash malon, even if you build up to add on to the 10th tefach of the well, of the pit, you will be chayiv for that as well. Rav asked the kasha, tam tefach v'silei kavan of mahu. So we'll say this is another interesting case. Let's say I come to a pit, and the pit has 9 tefachim. And tam tefach, Rashi says, hachoper bar tes v'achar shimul asara, v'chazar achron v'sasam umilei afar osa tefach. Let's listen to this case. I come to a pit, that's 9 tefachim. It's 9 tefachim. What happens? I dig a 10th tefach. Then I come to Daf Yomi, I realize, what did I do? I run back, I fill in my tefach. I fill in my tefach that I dug. So I'll say, so what is the halacha? So do we say, well, once I go ahead and fill in the tefach that I dug, I'm done. Meaning the bar is back in the Rishus of Ruvain, it's no longer my bar. I've taken back that which I contributed. Odilma, nestalku ma'serishon v'kamele kule b'rshuse. Or Rabbi say, maybe we say what? No. Once I dug that 10th tefach, then what Rabbi say? That bar is mine. And that even if I go ahead and I fill in the tefach that I dug, that pit is still mine. So we'll say it's a fundamental shaila, by the way, about, you see this all the time. People get involved in certain things. And then what happens? They don't like the way their involvement went. So they say, okay, I'm taking a step back. Whoa, you're taking a step back, right? You inserted yourself into this process. That's really the shayla. Once you insert yourself into a process, do you own that process or not? That's the fundamental machlokes. You saw this thing, life machlokes. So do we say, well, look, as long as you take back what you put in, right? You take back your stuff. So it's like a reset. It's back to where it was. Or the second man says, no. Once you put yourself in there, that's your bar. That's your bar. You insert yourself into the process. You're part of this process. To which the Gemara says, Tegu. Alright, so Eliyahu is going to have to answer this one for us. Let's go a little bit weiter. Amar Rabbi Rachana Shmuel Bar Marta. Bar Shmona, let's listen to this case. If you have a bar that's 8 tefachim deep, umehem shnei tefachim mayim. 2 of those tefachim are water. So 8 tefachim of open space, 2 tefachim of water. Chayiv. One is chayiv, Rabbi say, for having a bar of 10 tefachim. What's the reason? My taima called tefach the maya kitrei diabasha. Because Rabbi say, interesting enough, apparently water. What you understand? Water in a pit makes the airspace in the pit even more foul because it's standing stagnant water. So the Gemara says essentially 1 tefach of water is like 2 tefachim of open space. So if you have 8 tefachim, ultimately of airspace and 2 tefachim of water, so the pit is considered to be a 10 tefach pit capable of killing. So the Gemara says, bar tisha mehen tefach echad mayim. What happens if the bar is 9 tefachim deep, 9 tefachim of airspace, 1 tefach of water? What's the halacha? Do we say that since there's not so much water, therefore the water doesn't really create so much noxious air? Oh, Dilma, and therefore again, it's considered to be like a 9 tefach pit, and not like a 10 tefach pit. Oh, Dilma kevan da amik tvei ispe havlo. Or perhaps again, since the pit is deeper, meaning there is 9 tefachim of open airspace, the tefach of water does come out with it to form a 10 tefach pit. So next case, we're going to ask a series of questions. Bar shiva. So what happens if you have a bar that has 10 tefachim of airspace, umehen shlosha tefachim mayim, and you have 3 tefachim of water? Ma, what's the halacha? Mi amrinon kevan den ifishe maya tvei ispe havlo. So do you say that what? Since there is a lot of, since there's a lot of water, therefore the air becomes even more noxious. O dilma kaven the lo less behavlo. Or do we say that because there's not a lot of airspace, therefore the air is not so noxious? So we'll say the answer to all these questions is tegu. Next. Rav Shizi asked the Rabbah. Here chiva maur. Rav says an interesting case. What happens if I come to a pit
and instead of making it deeper, I make it wider. Right? So what's the halacha mahu? What does the halacha say? What is the liability in such a case like this? Amalei hare miyei tavla. Well, one could say, I actually did a public service. Why? Because by widening the pit, Rabbi say, what do? You lessen the noxicity. That's not a word, I know, right? But you've lessened the noxiousness of the air, right? Because remember, more space, less noxious the air is. So perhaps if I've made the pit wide, I've actually done a public service. No. Remember again, if you make the pit wider, so what have you effectively done? Remember, by widening the pit, you've effectively made it more possible. That's what? Someone's going to fall into it. So Rav Ashi says, well, let's look. If when the person fell in, or if the animal fell in, they died as a result of the noxious air. If that's the case, then I didn't contribute towards that because I actually lessened the noxiousness of the air. Now, how you know why someone dies, we'll discuss. If a person died because of impact with the ground, then what? In that case, I am responsible because by widening the pit, I have widened the obstacle, and therefore, again, I'm responsible.
Even when there's hevel, it still made it more.
No, because but I lessened the hevel. Meaning, if a person dies because of hevel, I lessened that probability. Right? At the end, I took away the noxiousness of it. You want to say I brought it closer to the individual, but Lamaisa, I lessened the impact of the hevel. That I did. Says the Gemara Ikadam. The other possibility is Amar Rav Ashi Nechse Anan. Now, Gil, this is really what you're saying. Rav Ashi says, well, why don't we look as to where he fell in? Right? If he fell in on the side that I widened, then whether it's because of the air, the noxicity of the air, or the chabata, or the impact, I caused that. Right? Why did I cause that? Because I widened the pit over here, and he fell in because I widened the pit. But if he fell on the other side of the pit, what is the other side? The other side is the side that I didn't widen. Right? That's not the side that I widened. Then what? Then the Gemara says, if he died then because of impact, then I still didn't do anything. But if he died ultimately because of hevel, then perhaps again I actually lessened that. Hari nafal hari miyat havla. So I'll say ultimately again I lessened that. So I'll say in this other approach, which seems to be a little bit more intuitive, we look at ultimately again where did he fall in. If he fell on the side where I widened the pit, then I'm responsible for that because I brought the bar closer to this individual. But if Lamaise fell on the other side, I'm not responsible for that on either end. Because if it was impact, I didn't do anything. And if it was hevel, well, it couldn't have been hevel. Why? Because by widening the pit, ultimately I diminished the noxicity of the airspace itself. We'll stop over here for today. Stop. But it's I like noxiousness, right? Okay, whatever, you'll fill in the English. But we'll say, all right, so I think what we'll have to do. Okay, well, I'm going to decide what we'll do. Either I'll record it or we'll start early tomorrow. Stay tuned for the message on the WhatsApp group. We'll send that out today. Mir Hashem. Right. So we'll figure that out on the WhatsApp group. So what's up? But again, understand we are going ahead and leaving off still with a fundamental machlokes, meaning the Rebbe and Rabbanan machlokes still remains, which is what. Listen, okay, Nehemiah, before you post it, let me just finish the daf over here. Right? So again, I will say we are still going ahead and ending up with the machlokes over here of where you have two people participating in a bar who has final liability. Rabbanan saying second one always has final liability. Rebbe saying it's joint liability. For damages, both will be liable. For death, the second one who made the bar into an object capable of killing ultimately will be chayiv. We'll continue with that in Mir Hashem tomorrow.